Mother couldn't really support us on her own, so she rushed to get remarried after his death. The man she married and who eventually became my stepfather was an abusive alcoholic who regularly beat me whenever he thought I was out of line. He also did a lot of other things to me that I'd rather not remember, but since he was the one paying the bills and keeping food on the table, my mother pretended to not notice any of it. Not long after my mother remarried, my stepfather had us move out of our old house to one he bought in another town. I had to leave my old life behind. My friends, my school, and everything that reminded me of my birth father disappeared from my life the day we moved. I was truly alone from then on, left to deal with my stepfather's abuse with no one to turn to. The only bright side to the whole thing was that the new house was much bigger than our old one. I got my own bedroom, though it was a little worse for wear when we first got there. There were cobwebs on every corner, and a layer of dust covered
It's supposed
everything
to be a
from the
new house,
shelves
knowing all
to
that.
the
Okay.
rickety old bed I was supposed to sleep in. Of course, I was expected to clean it by myself, and that's what I did during my entire first day there. I swept and mopped the entire place myself, though I did miss a few spots, on account of being a short 7-year-old who couldn't reach the top shelves. I didn't want to bother my mother or stepfather about it though. I was afraid that my stepfather would see it as me being lazy and use it as an excuse to beat me again.
Yo,
So I decided that I just had to learn to live
respect
with a
for
couple
people
of
who do that. Do
cobwebs.
that. Ugh.
I ended up finding something strange while cleaning my room. The bed frame, which was there before we bought the house, had long scratch marks on the sides. It was a bit creepy, but I assumed that they were cat scratches left by the last occupant's pet. Later that night, as I was trying to sleep, I experienced my first ever case of sleep paralysis. I was laying on my sore and bruised back after being beaten by my stepfather earlier that day. I forgot why he did it, but it left me with a black eye afterwards. He tended to use any excuse he could find as an opportunity to pull out his belt. Just as I felt my mind drifting off to sleep from exhaustion, a sudden chill ran down my spine, and my eyes fluttered wide open while the rest of me was frozen in place. I could see my dusty ceiling and move my eyes around the room, but I couldn't move a muscle in my body. It was like every fiber of my being was being weighed down by some invisible force. The sensation was new to me, but I didn't panic. There were times when my stepfather beat me so badly that I'd crumple up on the floor unable to move for hours on end. And this didn't feel all too different from that. I was just glad that I wasn't in immense physical pain that usually came with me being unable to move. I finally fell asleep at some point in the night, though I can't remember when. I woke up to the sound of my stepfather shouting for me to get down for breakfast the next morning. He told me over breakfast with my mother that I couldn't be starting school for a while. At the time, I thought he was just being unusually nice to me by giving me some extra time to adjust to the new environment. Looking back, I think he just wanted to wait until the black eye he gave me healed before letting me go out. Later that night, I had sleep paralysis again. I froze in bed, unable to move, but this time I could also hear something coming from under my bed. It was the sound that someone would make while grinding their teeth together to chew a piece of hard candy. A bit weird, but I slept through worse. There were nights when my stepfather would argue loudly with my mother in the next room while drunk, and I always managed to sleep through that, so some weird noises under my bed was nothing. My stepfather hurt me again the next day. He didn't even bother to come up with a reasonable excuse that time. He came home in a bad mood because of something that happened at work. I was on the living room couch watching TV when he grabbed me by the shirt and threw me on the floor. "Lazy kids like you who do nothing all day just piss me off." He kicked me while I was down a few times before removing his belt. He folded the leather belt in half and began whipping me in the face with it. One of his lashes was so hard that it made a cut right over the black eye he gave me. My mother was in the kitchen, just one room over during the entire thing. I was sure she could hear him shouting at me, but like always, she did nothing to stop him. I went to bed with a new scar on my forehead that night. Minutes after I settled under my blankets, I felt my body freeze again, just like it had the previous nights. I'd already gotten used to the feeling, so I didn't think much of it, not even when I started hearing the grinding sound come from under my bed. I almost didn't notice the claw gripping the side of my bed frame before the monster under my bed pulled himself up. The monster who crawled up onto my bed was tall and spindly, with gray ashen skin and a bulbous head, like a stick figure that came to life. He perched himself on my chest with feet that looked like talons of a large bird. He was heavy, though not as heavy as I would have thought. The monster leaned forward, allowing me to clearly see his face despite the darkness. He had red eyes as large as an owl, and a fang-filled mouth that was too big for his face.
Ugh.
His breath smelled bad,
Obviously.
like rotten meat. But then again, so did my stepfather's after a night of drinking, and at least he wasn't shouting at me. As far as I'm concerned, that monster was the only person in my life who didn't ignore me like my father, or beat me like my stepfather. And if he ate me like monsters were supposed to, then at least I'd finally be able to rest. But he didn't do that. He just sat on my chest and stared at me. He made some grinding noises with his teeth again, but that was about it. At last, he tilted his head to one side, in what I thought must have been curiosity. I guess he wasn't used to meeting children who weren't scared of him. I felt bad for him when I realized that it must have been hard living under a bed with everyone too scared to be his friend. I eventually fell asleep with him sitting on my chest. When I woke up that morning, I rushed to the kitchen. My mother was in the garden, while my stepfather was still sleeping off his hangover from the previous night's drinking. I snuck out some cookies from the cookie jar and put it on a plate before rushing to my bedroom. When I got there, I tore a page out from my old school notebook and wrote, "To Mr. Boogeyman" on it.
Mr. Boogeyman.
I put the note under my bed with a plate of cookies on top of them, hoping that the boogeyman from the night before would enjoy them. Before I went to bed that night, I looked under my bed and was happy to see an empty plate with the cookies and a note nowhere in sight. I had sleep paralysis again as I tried to sleep, and the boogeyman rose from under my bed, just like he did the night before. But he seemed a lot friendlier this time around. He didn't just sit on my chest or put his face to me or anything. He just sat on my bedside looking at me. Sometimes he'd rub my head with his long fingers, the same way my real dad used to when he was alive. At one point, he even picked up my teddy bear to play with it. It looked so surreal that I wanted to laugh, but the sleep paralysis kept me from moving anything but my eyes. This went on for the next few days. I'd sneak a snack under my bed for Mr. Boogeyman, and he'd keep me company during the night as I fell asleep. Then one night, I made a mistake. I accidentally took one of my stepfather's beer cans from the fridge, thinking it was a soda to give to Mr. Boogeyman. That night, before I could even settle into bed, my stepfather barged into my bedroom. "You little bitch! Steal from me, would you?" Before I could even finish my sentence, he slapped me across the face with the back of his hand. I fell onto the bed and covered my head with my arms as my stepfather whipped my back over and over again with his folded leather belt. I heard him undo his zipper right before the sound of grinding teeth filled the air. I opened my eyes and saw my stepfather standing by my bed with a confused look on his face. Who's there?" He bent down to look under my bed. The moment he did, spindly gray arms shot out from the darkness and grabbed him by the throat. He tried to scream, but no air could escape his lungs as he was dragged kicking and flailing under my bed. When morning came, my mother found me crying under the blankets and my stepfather's corpse under the bed. The police who were called in determined the cause of death to be a heart attack caused by extreme fear. My mother was deemed unfit to raise me, and I was sent into foster care. I'm in a much better place now with a healthy family that cares for me. But sometimes, as I lay awake in bed at night, I can't help but wonder how Mr. Boogeyman, my only friend in those dark times, I wonder how he's doing.
Okay. It was more wholesome than scary. Like, that was, I would say out of all the ones I watched, that's the most wholesome one because even though it was sleep paralysis, it is a happy sleep paralysis in a way. Oh my goodness.